Oh, hi! You caught me being interrupted from reading by a vampire. Listen, it's autumn. If you're cold, they're cold. Consider inviting them inside. And hey, speaking of vampires, let's talk about one of the artists who was the best to draw Dracula, Gene Colan. Hello, welcome to Comic Tropes. I'm your host, Chris. Every October, I enjoy talking about stuff that's horror-related within comics. And today, I want to talk about an artist who I think did some fantastic work in the world of horror, but he's probably just as well known for his superhero work, Gene Colan. Gene worked from the tail end of the Golden Age all the way up through the Modern Age. He actually won an Eisner Award for an issue of Captain America that he did during Ed Brubaker's acclaimed run. So let's talk about Gene Colan's history and his techniques so that I can make the case for why I think his artwork was perfect for a horror book like the 1970s Marvel book Tomb of Dracula. Let's do it. Gene Colan was born in the Bronx, New York in 1926 and recalled in an interview with Roy Thomas that he began drawing as early as he could remember, trying to copy artists he liked, including Colton Waugh, Norman Rockwell, and Milton Caniff. His first published comics work was at Fiction House, doing a non-fiction page for their Wings comic book anthology in December of 1944, when he was still a teenager. After high school, Colan enlisted in the U.S. Air Corps and served in the Philippines. In an interview, he stated that he won an art contest at one of his stations. He then used the GI Bill to study at the Art Students League of New York. In his interview from Alter Ego number 6 from autumn of 2000, Gene recollects how he got his first regular work. Quote, "I was living with my parents. I worked very hard on a war story, about 7 or 8 pages long, and I did all the lettering myself, I inked it myself, I even had a wash effect over it. I did everything I could do, and I brought it over to Timely. What you had to do in those days was go to the candy store, pick up a comic book, and look in the back to see where it was published. Most of them were published in Manhattan. They would tell you the address, and you'd simply go down and make an appointment, or go down and see the art director. I got a job right away." Gene got a job as a staff penciler doing uncredited work for $60 a week on crime and horror books. But Timely hit hard times in 1948 and released almost their entire staff, including Gene. Gene quickly got work at National Comics, the predecessor to DC Comics, working primarily on war comics. His detailed art style could suit any type of story. His work evolved, but you can still note his early use of heavy shadows in these Golden Age comics. By the 1960s, romance comics were very popular, and Gene kept very busy at DC Comics working on a number of those. He also was secretly working for their competitor, Marvel Comics, at the same time. At this point in time, any artist that could do more than one monthly book might want to work at a competitor, but Marvel and DC didn't like their artists working for their competition, so you usually had to work under a pseudonym. Gene Colan did this working on books like Tales to Astonish and Tales of Suspense under the pseudonym Adam Austin. It's interesting to compare Colan's early superhero work here to his later work. By the 70s, Colan was usually inked by top-tier pros like Frank Yakoya and Tom Palmer, who played to Colan's strengths with ink washes over his graphite-heavy penciled pages and detailed rendering. When you look at this example of his early superhero work under the pseudonym Adam Austin, Vince Colletta strips away all the detail to show us just the underlying form and composition, which are still strong. Bill Everett gave Colan's work a bit more organic, rounded line work, but also stripped away the penciled shading, yet leaned into Colan's heavy shadows. Soon, Colan was working at Marvel as they began making superhero comics with early runs on Doctor Strange, Captain America, and a long run on Daredevil. In an interview with Daniel Best for Adelaide Comics and Books, Colan explained his relationship with writer and editor Stan Lee, saying, quote, "Whatever book he thought was selling, he would have the rest of the staff try to copy the same style of work, but I wouldn't do it. I'd tell him, if you want Steve Ditko, then you have to get Stevie Ditko. I can't do it. I have to be myself." So he left me alone. He knew I meant it, and that I couldn't do it, and that there was no point in trying to force me to do it. Stan recognized something in my work from the very start, whatever that was, that gave me my first big break. And I always got along very well with Stan. Not everyone can say that, but I did. And it's true. Looking at Colan's books, his art was very different from someone like Kirby, who was the most popular artist at Marvel with readers. But Colan contributed a lot, including co-creating important characters like the Falcon, the first African-American superhero in mainstream superhero comics, the original Marvel version of Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, a supporting character in that book, the first Guardians of the Galaxy, and many more. Colan told the Comics Journal his photorealistic style was based on reference that he would take. For instance, he walked around Greenwich Village with his camera to make sure Doctor Strange's neighborhood looked right. He also admitted to Comic Book Artist magazine in 2001 that he used amphetamines at this time to stay awake and hit his deadlines on his detail-heavy pages. I've discussed this before in an episode on displaying motion in comics, but Colan came up with some innovative techniques on his Daredevil run to show how fast the hero moved through the city. His dark, atmospheric style worked especially well with a street-level hero that operated at night, blending in with the shadows of the alleyways. And now let's talk about the reason for the season, but before I discuss Gene Colan's Dracula work at Marvel, I'd like to briefly touch on some other horror work he did for Warren Publications, because it's a rare example of Gene Colan inking his own work. From 1966 through 1967, Colan illustrated some short horror stories for Warren on both creepy and eerie magazines, while working at Marvel as well. These stories are gorgeous, using deep blacks for inks and ink washes for grades of light. They show Colan's mastery of drawing real things, from cars to people to interesting environments. Horror was huge in the 50s, but the Comics Code Authority meant the end of its heyday. But in 1971, the Comics Code made some adjustments, which included allowing vampires to appear in books. Marvel jumped on that quickly, and the editorial team decided that they would use the most famous vampire of all, Dracula, since he was in the public domain. Marvel clearly didn't have much of an idea for what to do with it, though. For instance, while Stan Lee and Roy Thomas plotted the first issue, it was handed to Jerry Conway to script the dialogue. Conway then wrote the second issue by himself and told a story in the vein of the British Hammer horror films. Archie Goodwin wrote the book for issues 3 and 4. Then Gardner Fox wrote for 2 issues. Finally, Marv Wolfman took over with issue 7, running all the way through the final issue, number 70. The only stable element of the book in that first year was Gene Colan, who illustrated every single issue of the Tomb of Dracula run. But even Colan's moody visuals weren't the first choice for Marvel. Colan commented in a 2009 issue of Marvel Spotlight on how he got the job. He said, quote, "When I heard Marvel was putting out a Dracula book, I confronted Stan Lee about it and asked him to let me do it. He didn't give me too much trouble, but as it turned out, he took that promise away, saying he had promised it to Bill Everett. Well, right then and there, I auditioned for it. Stan didn't know what I was up to, but I spent a day at home and worked up a sample using Jack Palance as my inspiration and sent it to Stan. I got a call that very day. It's yours." Colan's art was perfect for the book. It's a horror comic focused on a villain, but also takes place within the Marvel Universe, and Colan had established himself as more than capable of drawing superheroes. So, when a character like Doctor Strange guest starred, it looked right. The book introduced various vampire hunters like Taj Natal, Hannibal King, Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, Blade, and others. He made them look brave and heroic, but also always on the back foot when going up against the powerful Dracula. Tomb of Dracula is a very interesting title. It's a rare example of a long-running book focused on a villain. And it's a villain with very different motivations than the bank robbers and world conquerors found in most superhero books. Dracula was much more insidious and personal. He'd transform people into minions. He'd hypnotize them and make them kill themselves. He was cruel and confident, and it was in that personality that the horror of the title emerged. Colan conveyed that menace expertly. According to Colan, he chose actor Jack Palance as the basis for the titular character, not an existing actor who had played Dracula like Bela Lugosi or Christopher Lee. However, after Tomb of Dracula started, Palance would end up playing the King of the Vampires in a TV movie that aired in 1974. The storytelling in Tomb of Dracula by Colan is also well thought out. He'd give panels wavy lines, or a page would get an off-kilter layout that helped add a subtle unease and tension to the book. Colan wasn't just a good illustrator, he was a masterful storyteller. Tomb of Dracula is one of the best comics that Marvel was putting out in the 70s. I think it holds up, and part of that is that it had a stable creative team, and it has a clear, definitive ending. However, that was actually rushed because the editor-in-chief at the time, Jim Shooter, decided he just didn't like it. In fact, working under Jim Shooter was so bad that Gene Colan says it led to him quitting Marvel Comics in 1981. Writer Marv Wolfman knew Shooter wanted to end Tomb of Dracula, but figured since he was both writer and editor of the book, he'd get permission to do a 3-issue closing arc. Instead, at the last minute, Shooter shortened that to a double-sized single issue. Wolfman had to scramble to cut some pages and re-script it to end it properly. You can find some pages that were cut from this and other Tomb of Dracula issues in the IDW-published Tomb of Dracula Artist Edition, a gorgeous look at Colan's original artwork. But events like that contributed to Colan deciding to leave. He told the Comics Journal about his experience working under editor-in-chief Jim Shooter, saying, quote, "I was miserable. It was the worst experience. One of the worst I've ever experienced. I had to leave Marvel because of him. I wouldn't stay, and I left everything behind. I left a pension plan, everything. I would have stayed, but Shooter gave me such a rough time. In fact, the vice president of Marvel had been down in a meeting with me and Shooter trying to pacify me and get me to stay. And I just wouldn't do it, because I could see the writing on the wall, and I knew where Shooter was heading, and I didn't want any more of it." But Colan continued to do fine. He went to DC and worked on Batman for years. Obviously, his style with its dark shadows worked great for a character like Batman. He continued to work for a wide variety of publishers, including DC, Marvel, Dark Horse, and others, up through 2009, just 2 years before he passed away. In 2009, he drew Captain America number 601 with writer Ed Brubaker, winning the Eisner Award for Best Single Issue. I love Gene Colan's artwork. When I was younger, I was attracted to the more detail-heavy hatching of artists like Todd McFarlane and Jim Lee, but as I grew older, I grew to love the confident figure work and clean storytelling of artists like Alex Toth and Gene Colan. I definitely recommend Tomb of Dracula. It's a really fun read. Keep this in mind though. While a lot of key characters get introduced in those early issues, the mythology itself doesn't really get going until the second year of its run. To that end, though, I would also strongly recommend the Tomb of Dracula Artist Edition. It's a great way to see Gene Colan's raw artwork. Folks, thanks so much for watching. I'll be back next week with another bit of a horror-themed episode to end October, our spooky season month. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting things like and subscribe. That always helps a lot. But I appreciate everything you guys do, and I can't wait to see you next time. Until then, keep reading comics. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please consider hitting like and subscribe. If you'd like to support the show, there are merchandise links beneath the YouTube video, and you can always hit join on YouTube or visit Comic Tropes on Patreon to get access to special perks.